Hey guys, welcome back to Pro Tools 101. Last week, we saw how we can import different kinds of media into Pro Tools. We imported different kinds of audio files and different kinds of video files. When you're importing audio, if the format is not the same as what Pro Tools works with, Pro Tools will convert the file to the format that you're recording in, which means Pro Tools will be able to work with audio only in the WAV or AIFF format. So if you're trying to import an MP3 file or maybe a MPEG-4 AAC file, Pro Tools will ask you to convert the file into WAV or AIFF depending on what your session settings are. If the sample rate of the file also does not match, Pro Tools will suggest that you convert the file to match the sample rate. That's because Pro Tools cannot play back audio that has been recorded in two different sample rates at the same time. Well, it can, but it's not going to play back at the right speed. So when you're importing an audio file, if the format matches your session, but the sample rate does not match, Pro Tools will again recommend that you convert the file instead of just adding it to your session. When you're importing audio files and the format matches, Pro Tools does give you a choice of either adding the file or copying the file into your audio files folder. It is always recommended that you copy the file into the audio files folder so that wherever you're importing the audio from, Pro Tools and the session that you're working in is not dependent on the file being in that location whenever you open your Pro Tools project or your session again. Which means if your file is on a USB stick, it's best to copy the file into the audio files folder when you are importing so that when Pro Tools opens up the session again, it does not need to find the USB stick. It can find the file in the audio files folder, which is what will happen if you select to copy the file instead of adding the file. Adding the file means Pro Tools will always look for the file in the USB stick, right? So do remember that every time you import your audio file. When you are dragging and dropping a file, either from the Workspace browser or directly from your Finder window or your Windows Explorer window, do remember that Pro Tools does not copy the file if the sample rate and the format is a match. If it's not a match, Pro Tools will automatically convert the file and make it compatible, and the converted file will automatically be created and placed in your audio files folder. So you don't need to be worried about that. But if you do want to be sure that every time you drag and drop a file that Pro Tools will copy the file into the audio files folder, there is a setting in your setup preferences where you can go and tell Pro Tools to automatically copy files every single time you import, which means whether it is a match or not a match in the format or sample rate, Pro Tools will always copy the file to the audio files folder. It's very highly recommended that you turn this setting on and just leave it on at all times. We also spoke about working with interleaved files and non-interleaved files, or multi-channel files as they are known as, which means when Pro Tools is recording a stereo file or any multi-channel file, Pro Tools will be able to create either one file in interleaved with multiple channels in it, or it will create one file per channel of audio in the non-interleaved format. It does not matter in terms of the quality of the sound. It makes absolutely no difference. It does not make a difference even to the total file size that you have. So the only difference it makes is the number of files that you're going to end up having. So if it's not something that you have to have on, but if you do, when you're working in music production, it's better to leave it on so that you don't have too many files and it's easy to find things when you need them, right? Importing video files, we saw how you can import video from a QuickTime file and from an Avid MXF file format. I shared the files with you. Hopefully you got a chance to play with them as well. If you're using Pro Tools Ultimate, Pro Tools can import more than one video file. You can have more than one video track in your session as well. If you're working with a standard version of Pro Tools, you are allowed only one video file and video track. If you do have multiple video tracks in your session, always remember to make sure that the track that you want to play has the online button turned on. That's the blue O button that you see under the track nameplate. Only the track which is online will be able to play back the video. Pro Tools cannot play back video from multiple tracks at the same time. It's not a video editing software, it's an audio editing software, right? So you have the bare minimum capabilities that are needed to just play back video files. Moving on. Today we're going to talk about MIDI. We're going to talk about how we can make our first MIDI recording. We're going to try and understand the basics of the MIDI protocol itself. We're going to see how we can actually record MIDI into Pro Tools, what features Pro Tools has that enables us to record MIDI, like what are the kinds of tracks onto which we can record MIDI as well. We're going to try and get a deeper look at the difference between sample-based operations and tick-based operations. This is where it becomes really important to understand the difference because we are working with MIDI and audio now, right? We're also going to see how we can set our main time-based ruler and our main timescales, the different ways in which we can actually change that and use what we need for MIDI recording. We're going to prepare our system to record some MIDI as well. All right. And we're going to see how we can play around with some of the virtual instruments that come with Pro Tools, namely Expand, Boom, and the Falcon plugin. Right. I'll be reviewing these 3 plugins in detail today. So let's start. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It's a protocol for connecting electronic instruments, performance controllers, and computers so they can communicate with one another. MIDI is not audio. Always remember that. MIDI is data, which means it's not stored as a waveform. It's stored as binary information. What kind of information gets stored when I record MIDI? Information about a performance, such as the pitch, the duration, and the intensity of whatever I am playing in the performance. MIDI devices or MIDI controllers, they transmit this performance data via MIDI messages. So when I press a key on my MIDI controller, a message carrying 3 key pieces of information is sent as a MIDI message. The MIDI message carries which key I have pressed, for how long I have pressed it, and how hard I press the key as the information. That is the pitch, the duration, and the velocity. Up to 16 separate channels of MIDI information can be sent over a single MIDI cable, which means we can use a single MIDI cable to control multiple MIDI devices or control a single device that is capable of multi-channel or multi-timbral operations. There are other kinds of information that can be carried via MIDI as well, such as pan volume, information for instruments that support them, as well as program change events or commands that tell MIDI instruments which of their available sounds or patches to use. A MIDI sequencer is what allows us to store, edit, and play back this MIDI information that can be used to control devices such as a synthesizer, a sound module, drum machines, and so on. These MIDI devices don't have to be external hardware devices because today they are all plugins. We have our sound samplers, we have our drum machines, we have our synthesizers, all available to us as software plugins. So our MIDI sequencer takes our MIDI information, our MIDI messages that we are sending from our MIDI controller, and sends it to these synthesizers or virtual instruments that are inside the sequencer itself. Right? Pro Tools is basically a MIDI sequencer as well. It allows us to import, record, edit MIDI in pretty much the same way that we do our audio as well. MIDI data appears in tracks in the Pro Tools edit window, referencing the same timeline as our audio tracks. In the mix window, corresponding channel strips appear and include familiar mixer-style controls that affect the track's playback. For detailed MIDI composition and editing tasks, Pro Tools even has a MIDI editor window. As we saw a few weeks back, Pro Tools has 2 types of tracks for working with MIDI data: MIDI track and an instrument track. A MIDI track stores MIDI notes and controller data only, not audio. In fact, no audio can pass through a MIDI track. If we wish to hear the MIDI performance stored on a MIDI track, we need to send that MIDI information to a synthesizer or a virtual instrument, which will take that data and convert it to sound. But then to hear the sound, we need an aux track, as the MIDI track itself is not capable of routing audio signals. This can be solved by using an instrument track, which basically provides the functionality of a MIDI track with audio, which means it's a MIDI and an aux track combined. Like MIDI tracks, instrument tracks will store the notes and controller data, but instrument tracks can also route audio signals that are generated by a virtual instrument on the track for monitoring and playback purposes. This makes life a little easy. It allows us to record and listen to our recording from the same track without having to create multiple tracks, right? So let's start by creating a MIDI track first. I'm going to use my shortcut to create a new track, Command-Shift-N, and from here I'm going to select MIDI track and then say create, and now I have my MIDI track ready. If you do have a MIDI controller connected to your system, Pro Tools will be able to see it automatically. There's not much configuration that needs to go in. But just to confirm that Pro Tools can actually see it, you can come up to your setup menu, come down to MIDI, and select MIDI input devices. Over here, you should see a MIDI controller that is connected to your computer via the USB port. Right? I see my Nectar SE49 connected over here, and I also see my iPad, which can work as a MIDI controller as well, right? But for today, I'm going to use the Nectar 49 key keyboard that I have connected over here. So I'm just going to say OK. And now if I hit the record button, I basically telling Pro Tools that this track should receive the MIDI signals that I play on my MIDI controller. So with the track record armed, if I press any key, I should be seeing signal on the track. There we go. Right? But I see the data going into the MIDI track. I can't hear anything. Obviously, that's because MIDI is not audio. MIDI is only seeing the data that is coming from my computer keyboard. Which means if I actually do a recording now over here, let's just do a dummy recording. I can see my MIDI notes have been recorded over here, but there's no sound that is coming from it. This MIDI data needs to be sent to a virtual instrument in order to get the sound or in order to play back the sound. If I come into my mix window over here, I will see that I cannot insert any plugin into my MIDI track directly. That's because MIDI cannot work with audio. So if I wanted to send this MIDI data to a virtual instrument, I need to put that virtual instrument on a track that will be able to play back the sound that's coming out from the virtual instrument. So let's go ahead and create an aux track. Command-Shift-N again. I'm going to create an aux input over here. I'm going to make it stereo because most of the samples that come with virtual instruments are sampled in stereo. And I'm going to say create. And now on the insert section of this aux track, I'm going to insert a virtual instrument. And let's go with the Mini Grand for now. There we go. Now that I have the virtual instrument in Pro Tools, I need to tell my MIDI track to send the MIDI data that is on it to this virtual instrument. The only way to do that is to actually change the output of that particular track itself, right? So if I come to the input-output section of my MIDI track over here, when I click on the output, it shows me the plugin that I have. It shows me the virtual instruments that I already have in my session. If I had more than one virtual instrument over here, Pro Tools will show me all the virtual instruments that I had in my session. As of now, I only have one, which is on track aux1. It's called the Mini Grand. So I'm going to select the Mini Grand over here. And now when I play back, Pro Tools will be able to play back the MIDI data through the Mini Grand plugin. Let's go back to the edit window so that I can see my MIDI data being played. I'm going to hit play. And we have our sound. So this is one way of recording your MIDI information, but it's not a very easy way. Like every time I wanted to play a small piece of piano, I would have to create a MIDI track. I would have had to create an aux track. Then I'd had to change the output of my MIDI track to make sure it goes to the right plugin. It can get complicated, right? So we can use the easier way, or we can use the alternate way, which is to create an instrument track instead. Again, I'm going to do Command-Shift-N to bring up the New Tracks dialog box. I'm going to select Instrument Track. I want it to be stereo again, and I'm going to say Create. And now I have an instrument track over here. Let's take a look at the instrument track in my mix window. If you compare the MIDI track with the instrument track over here, you will see a couple of things that are different. The first thing that is different that you will notice is that my instrument track does allow me to insert plugins, which means I can insert my instrument directly into the instrument track itself. I can use my virtual instrument plugin directly on my instrument track, right? So let's bring up the mini grand again on the instrument track. I'm going to go to the plugins, instrument, and I'm going to select mini grand. There we go. So now I have a second instance of the mini grand, right? I have a mini grand on my aux track and I have a mini grand in my instrument track. If I come back to the output of my MIDI track, Pro Tools will now show me both my mini grands over here. It shows me that I can send it to the mini grand 1, which is on the aux track, or I can send it to the second virtual instrument, which is on my instrument track over here, right? So I can send it to any of these virtual instrument plugins. But because I'm using an instrument track, I don't need to do that, right? I don't need to record my MIDI on a different track because my instrument track has the capability of recording MIDI itself. And all the MIDI that comes into my instrument track will automatically go to my mini grand instrument that has been put as an insert on my instrument track. So now if I press a key on my keyboard, I can hear the sound coming from this mini grand plugin that is inserted on my instrument track, right? What if I wanted to change the MIDI input-output for this instrument track? If you look really carefully, the input-output section that's available to you on the instrument track is not the same as the input-output section available to you on the MIDI track. The MIDI track will only show you the MIDI input and the MIDI output. That means it's going to show you the MIDI devices under the MIDI section, under the MIDI input section over here, and it's only going to show you the MIDI devices or MIDI outputs that you have available. Whereas an instrument track is going to show you the same input output that the aux track was going to show you. That means it's going to show you the audio input output, not the MIDI input output. So if I did have multiple MIDI controllers, like if I wanted to use my iPad to send a signal to the MIDI, to the instrument track over here, instead of my MIDI controller, instead of the 49 key MIDI controller that I have here, there needs to be a way in which I can change the MIDI input output for my instrument track. There are situations when people have multiple MIDI controllers, and I'm pretty sure you've seen photographs of composers where they have 3 keyboards here, 3 keyboards to the right, 3 keyboards to the left, and they're playing with both their hands at the same time across multiple keyboards at the same time. All those keyboards are sending MIDI data to their DAW. All of them are being sent on multiple channels. That means one keyboard may be set to channel 1, channel 2, channel 3. Each keyboard has its own channel number. So if I wanted channel 1 to go to a specific instrument in my DAW, I could tell my DAW to assign that channel number for my MIDI into that instrument. Similarly, I could do that for the other instruments as well. But within Pro Tools, within my instrument track, there needs to be a way in which I can define which instrument is going to send the MIDI data to this particular track or to the plugin on this particular track. If I want to see the MIDI input-output for my instrument track, I need to come to the View menu. I'm in my Mix window, so I go to my Mix window views, and over here, I enable Instruments. And when I do that, I get the MIDI input-output section over here. Now, this input-output that we see over here is the same as my MIDI input-output. Right? So if I actually click on the input section over here, again, I will see my different MIDI controllers that I have connected to my system at this time. And if I wanted only one specific MIDI controller to send information to this particular signal, I could select only that instead of all, which is the default for the instrument input track. Similarly, in the output over here, I can make sure that it goes to the right virtual instrument at all times. By default, it will go to the first MIDI virtual instrument that you put on the instrument track. But if for some reason you have more than one on this track and you wanted to send it to that particular one, you could change the output of your MIDI signal from this section over here. So the input output that you see on the track itself, that's under the sends, you will notice that that is the same as the aux track input output. That means that's where the audio signal can go out from, right? So the input output on an instrument track is not the same as an input output on a MIDI track. Keep that in mind. If you wanted to change the MIDI input output for the instrument track, again, come up to the View menu, you go to the Mix window views, and you need to turn on your instruments so that you can see your MIDI input output directly on the instrument track itself. Cool? If you would have noticed, when I actually tried to create a new track over here, when I selected my MIDI track, there are two things that I want to highlight over here. First off, I cannot choose whether my MIDI track needs to be mono or stereo. That's because MIDI is not audio. MIDI is data, and data cannot be mono or stereo. Data is data, right? It's just a set of ones and zeros. Now, what you do with that data can be mono or stereo, which means if I send that data to a virtual instrument that is created in mono, I will get back only mono sounds from that virtual instrument. If I send it to a virtual instrument whose samples have been recorded in stereo, I will get a stereo return from that particular virtual instrument, right? So MIDI track itself cannot be mono or stereo. It does not allow you to choose mono or stereo. But that is not the case with an instrument track. When you choose an instrument track, you can choose between mono and stereo. That's because the instrument track controls audio as well. The instrument track is not going to apply the mono and stereo concept to the MIDI data, but it's going to apply it to the sound that is coming out from the virtual instrument when you record MIDI onto that particular track, right? The second thing I want to highlight in this particular new tracks dialog box is this. This is what we call the track time base. You can choose it to be ticks or you can choose it to be samples. There are two choices between when you're creating a track. By default, when you do create an instrument track or a MIDI track, Pro Tools will always select ticks as the default time base. But if you go to create any other type of track, like an audio track, Pro Tools will set the time base to be samples instead of ticks. What's the difference between sample-based and tick-based time bases? The difference between sample-based operation and tick-based operations are essentially the difference between how audio data is stored and how MIDI data is stored. In sample-based operations, our recordings are tied to fixed points in time relative to the beginning of the session, which means our recordings have an absolute position in time. Our clips are not affected by the session tempo, and they will not move in position if the session tempo changes, though their position relative to the bars and beats will change. Which means if I have a recording that starts at the 4th second and continues till the 10th second, and then I do a tempo change, my recording will still be starting at the 4th second and end at the 10th second. Audio tracks can also be set to tick-based operations to perform specialized functions such as tempo matching. Pro Tools has a feature called elastic audio, which will automatically change the audio as well if you want. But it's not something that's recommended, not something that you should do when you're making a song, definitely, but it is something that can be done if you need to. In tick-based operations, recorded information is tied to specific bar beat locations in a performance. So when we record MIDI data, Pro Tools uses tick-based timing to determine the location of our MIDI events. MIDI events are recorded relative to particular bar and beat locations, such as bar 6, beat 3, and their locations in time adjust based on the session's tempo, which means if I changed my session's tempo, my MIDI information will still be at bar 6 beat number 3. The MIDI data will just play back faster or slower depending on what I have done with my tempo, right? So if a tempo decreases, my MIDI data will play back slowly. If my tempo increases, my MIDI data will play back faster, but it will still play back at bar number 6, beat number 3. The location of their bar and beat does not change. But because the speed changes, it can change its location in time. Let's go back and see how that works, right? Let's just cancel out of this. Let's just delete these 2 tracks that I don't need. I'm going to delete the aux and the instrument track for now so that I have one MIDI track over here. I'm going to create one more MIDI track. And this time, instead of ticks, I'm going to tell Pro Tools to make this track in samples, right? So I'm going to say create. I have MIDI 1 and I have MIDI 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a copy of my MIDI information that I have onto the same track below, right? So I have this information over here. Let's say my first track, which is tick based, is going to start at the 5th second, and my second track is also going to start at the 5th second. Now let's change our time scale to show us bars and beats, because when we're working in music, that is basically what we want to be referencing. So I'm going to come to my main time scale or my main counter display area over here, and I'm going to click on this arrow and select bars and beats, right? So now I can see that both my clips are starting at bar number 3 and beat number 3. Now, what do you think happens if I change my tempo? My tempo is currently set to 120 BPM. If I increase my tempo, if I make it 240 BPM, my audio is going to double in speed, which means my MIDI should play back much faster. Let's try doing that. I'm going to change my tempo from 120 BPM. I'm going to double it to 240 and press enter and see what has happened to the MIDI on my tracks. The MIDI data on track 2 has not changed its position. It hasn't moved at all. Right? It is at the 5th second still. But the MIDI data on my first track, on MIDI 1 track, has moved in time, but it has not moved its position with respect to bars and beats. The MIDI data still starts at bar number 3 and beat number 3, whereas the MIDI data on track number 2 starts at bar number 6 now, instead of bar number 3, beat number 3. That's because it has not changed its position with respect to time. That's how audio works. Now, when you're recording audio, we are recording audio based on the sample rate, which means all our audio has to be sample accurate. That is the smallest resolution of audio that you can edit, one sample. So everything that is being recorded by the computer is going to be fixed. The sample position is going to be fixed in time. But when it comes to MIDI, MIDI does not bother about samples because MIDI is not audio. MIDI is data, and that data is dependent on what we call ticks. This number that we see over here is what we call the ticks. So you have the bars, the beats, and the ticks. Even though it's 3 digits, the number does not go all the way up to 999. In fact, the last number that you see that we can get over here is 959. So 960 ticks per quarter note. You can actually see that by clicking on the ticks itself and then going back or pressing the down arrow to see the previous number. And it will show you that it was 959. So from 000, which is your first one, to 959, which is the 960th tick. When MIDI data is actually recorded, its position is based on the position of the tick. That means the MIDI information is stored based on the bars, beats, and the tick location for that particular information, for that particular data. Which is why when you change your tempo, it will still remain with the bars and beats position. Everything gets resized based on the bars and the beats location. Everything in MIDI is tick based. Your MIDI resolution is tick based. Which means, like, if I'm recording audio and I'm recording at 48,000 samples per second, it means I can have 48,000 samples in every second of audio that I'm recording. But when it comes to MIDI, I have 960 ticks or 960 unique locations where my MIDI data can reside. That's what we call the MIDI resolution. right? So I'm going to change my tempo back to 120 BPM and I press enter, and you can see that my the MIDI data on my MIDI 1 track has returned to its original position. The bar and beat data remains the same. It is bar number 3, beat number 3. And the second clip of MIDI that I have here, which was starting at bar number 6, it has now come back to bar number 3 because its position is based on time. Its position is based on sample. Its position is not based on the tick, right? Similarly, when you are creating an audio track, you do have the choice of creating tick-based audio track as well, which means when you change your tempo, you can have your audio change in speed and position as well. Of course, you need to have something called elastic audio turned on for this function to work perfectly, but it is possible. It's not recommended, but it is possible if you really need to, right? So that's the difference between sample-based operations and tick-based operations. When you're working with music, we want our timing reference to be bars and beats, always, right? And as I showed you, one way to actually set it is by clicking on the small arrow over here and choosing bars and beats. If you want a double reference, that means if you want another timing reference, you can tell Pro Tools to show you a sub counter as well, which means Pro Tools will now show you 2 timescales within this main window. You can set the first one to be bars and beats and the second one to be minutes and seconds, so that you have a timing reference in terms of actual time as well, or how long your song is. There are other time-based rulers that you can use in Pro Tools, and you want Pro Tools to actually show you. Mainly, when you're working in music production, we are mostly concerned with the tempo. We are mostly concerned with the meter, right? So if we want to see these rulers along with our bars and beats rulers, we can tell Pro Tools to show it to us in a couple of different ways. The first way is to come up to the view menu, because I want to change the view of my existing window itself. I want to change something in a window that I'm already viewing. So I come up to my view menu, I go to rulers, and I tell Pro Tools to show me more rulers. I want to see my tempo ruler. So I come down and select my tempo, and now I can see my tempo ruler. I go back, I want to choose to see my meter ruler as well. I can choose to see my meter ruler by enabling it over here. There's another way to enable a ruler as well. I can tell Pro Tools to show me a ruler by clicking on this small arrow next to the main ruler that I have. So if I come to this small arrow next to bars and beats, clicking on it will pop up the same choices. So if I want to see my meters now, I can just select meter, and my Pro Tools will now show me my meters ruler as well. Hiding a ruler is also pretty easy. We use the option key to do the opposite action. So if I wanted to hide a particular ruler, like if I wanted to hide my markers ruler, I can just hold down option and then click on the name markers, and it's gone, right? Of course, you could use this section over here to actually show or hide your markers, or you could come back to the view, rulers menu and select or unselect your markers itself. Usually, if you're working in a small screen, you can tell Pro Tools to show you only what you need. You don't want to waste your screen space by seeing stuff that you're not going to use at all times, right? So that's how you can show or hide a particular ruler. You cannot hide your main ruler that you're using. That is your main time scale that you're using. In this case, my main time scale is bars and beats. So I will not be able to hide my main ruler, which is bars and beats. If I wanted to hide my bars and beats, I would have to tell Pro Tools to show me another ruler. I need to make that my main time scale, and then I can hide my bars and beats ruler from my edit window view, right? So these are the different timescales that you will use. When I showed my tempo ruler over here, we can see that Pro Tools shows me the tempo of my session over here. The default tempo that Pro Tools uses for every session is 120 BPM. You can change your tempo by just clicking on the tempo itself over here, on the tempo field over here, and typing a new tempo. So if I wanted to make it 100 BPM, I just type in 100 and press enter, and now my session tempo is 100. I can see the change reflect on my track as well, right? Or I can make sure my session is right at the beginning. I can click on the plus sign on the ruler as well, and then tell Pro Tools to change my tempo. So if I want to bring it back to 120, I can say 120 and say OK. and now Pro Tools has restored my tempo to 120 BPM. I can do the same for the meter as well. So I can just click on the plus sign on my meter track, and I can tell Pro Tools, well, this is supposed to be a waltz, so I want it to be 3/4, not 4/4, and I say OK. And automatically you will also see that your grid lines reflect that. So now that my meter is set to 3/4, I can see that every bar is split only into 3 and not 4, right? You can also change your meter by just coming down and double clicking on the meter itself over here. You'll get the same meter change window. So if you wanted to restore it back to 4/4, I say OK. And now again, I see that my change reflects on my grid as well. If you can't see these blue grid lines on your Pro Tools session, make sure your grid button is on. So if you turn it off, the grid lines are not going to go. Make sure this grid button is highlighted and it is on so that you can actually see your grid on your timeline. So let's create an instrument track. Go with stereo instrument, say create, and I'm going to instantiate the same piano plugin that I had. It's a mini grand. That is loaded. So now when I press record enable, I should get sound. Cool. I'm going to go ahead and delete these two MIDI tracks so that we just have one track to work with for now. So Pro Tools gives you a warning saying that there is some MIDI information on this track. Are you really sure you want to delete it? I'm just going to say yes. All right, and let's come back to the edit window and let's try doing a recording. All right. If you recall, we had discussed a couple of different options that are available to you when you do your MIDI recording. One of the first and the really cool functions that Pro Tools allows you is something known as wait for note. I have my track record enabled. So now if I press the shortcut to record, which is the F12 key or the number 3 key on a full-size keypad, Pro Tools is not going to start recording. Pro Tools is going to wait for me to actually press something on my keyboard, right? So I'm just going to play something simple. There we go. And stop. So as you saw, Pro Tools waited for me to start, which means the first note that I pressed is not going to be cut off. It is going to be at the start of the bar itself, right? It's not going to get cut off by mistake. The metronome, we all know what that is. But if we have a click track and we use a click track, the metronome is going to make the click sound happen for us. If I turn it off, Pro Tools is not going to give me the click sound. The MIDI merge function is a pretty cool function, which I want to show you now over here. So I'm going to turn on the MIDI merge function. And if I wanted to add more information to this MIDI recording that I already have on my track, right? That's what the MIDI merge function allows me to do. So I'm going to press record again, and you can see that Pro Tools is at the beginning of the session, which means it's going to start recording right from the beginning of my track itself. But it's not going to overwrite any of the data that's already there, right? I'm going to play something completely different so that you can hear the difference. You can hear the contrast, right? So I'm going to just play, I don't know what I'm going to play. I'm not a player, right? I press stop. And you can see that it has actually merged that MIDI information for me, right? So now when I play back, I'm going to hear what I played both the times together at the same time. I know, I don't play well. Apologies. I'm not a musician. I'm an engineer, but still, just wanted to show you how that actually works. Right, so that's what the MIDI merge function does. So whenever you use MIDI merge, you can actually add MIDI controller data. You can add information to your playing that has already been recorded. You can get much more complex MIDI controllers that allow you to add things like breath information, or you can add pitch bends later on. You know, many people are not good at bending pitches as they play. So you can actually first play and then you can just do your pitch bend in the next pass, right? So it's pretty cool. Allows you to do that as well. So you can just layer your MIDI data on top of your information that you already have. So if you're not a piano player and you don't know how to use both hands, you know how to use only one finger at a time, like me, then you can record one finger at a time and then sound like Mozart at the end. Not that whatever I do, I can never sound like Mozart, but you get the idea. You can actually do that. Pro Tools gives you the functionality and the option to actually do that as well. If you're working with a track and you don't know the tempo of the track, as I told you last time, you can just use the tempo field, just select it, press the letter T along with the song. So maybe you have an MMO, you want to calculate the tempo of that song. You can just select the tempo field, keep pressing T along with it, and then once you find the right BPM, press return, and Pro Tools will tell you the tempo of that particular track itself, right? So the tempo, calculating your tempo is also really, really easy in Pro Tools, right? But do remember to press enter once you find the right tempo so that Pro Tools can actually map, or the conductor can register that the tempo has actually changed. If you don't want the conductor to control the tempo, you can turn the conductor off. How does that actually matter? Well, it matters only when you want to do tempo changes within your session. Now, when I turn the conductor off, you will see that on my tempo ruler, it says manual tempo, which means the tempo that I set right at the beginning of my session cannot change for the entire song. If I want the tempo to change in between, I have to make sure that the conductor is on, or the tempo map or the tempo ruler is enabled. Right? So with my tempo ruler enabled, my session starts at 120 BPM. Let's say at bar number 2, I want my tempo to change. So I click on my ruler in bar number 2 over here. I click on the plus sign and I can tell Pro Tools at bar number 2, I want you to change the tempo to 60 BPM. Let's go half, right? I'm going to say okay. And now you can see automatically that my MIDI notes have actually changed. They have conformed to the tempo change that I have actually set. Let's play this back now to see what it sounds like. So we can hear the tempo change as well. Right? So that's what the tempo ruler enabled does. I can see the tempo changes happening on my tempo track itself. So let's say I wanted to change my tempo again at bar number 3. So I click on bar number 3. I come to my tempo change dialog box. I say go back to 120 BPM and say OK. So now it's going to play bar number 1 at 120 BPM, bar number 2 at 60 BPM, and bar number 3 at 120 BPM again. Right? Let's see this. Of course, there's not much information at bar number 3 for you to hear that drastic tempo change, but this is how you can apply tempo changes. You can apply meter changes as well, right? So if I wanted to change my meter from bar number 2 onwards, all I need to do is come to bar number 2, click on the plus sign on my meter ruler, and I can change my meter directly from here, right? So that's how you can apply tempo changes and meter changes. Now, if you want Pro Tools to follow these tempo changes and the meter changes, the conductor needs to be on. If I turn my conductor off, Pro Tools will go back to the tempo that I had set in the manual tempo mode, which is 100 BPM, right? If you turn the conductor back on, he remembers everything. Everything comes back and Pro Tools will play back with all the tempo and meter changes that you have within your session. There is one thing that you need to understand though, and sometimes when you connect a MIDI device, you may or may not hear sound. And this is not only for Pro Tools, this is something that applies to all DAWs. When we press a key on our MIDI keyboard, the data from my MIDI controller goes into our sequencer, which is Pro Tools in this case, right? I need to tell Pro Tools to take that MIDI data that's coming in from my MIDI controller and pass it through to the virtual instrument, right? So by default, there is a function in Pro Tools called MIDI Through, and it is on. But for some reason, when you play your MIDI controller, if you cannot get sound, if you do not hear any sound, it could be that your MIDI Through is turned off by mistake. So do check. If you want to turn on your MIDI Through, all you need to do is come to the options menu and then turn on MIDI Through. Again, as I said, by default, it is on, so you should not have a problem, but it needs to be on if you want your MIDI data to go through the sequencer to the virtual instrument that is on your track. right? So that's what the MIDI Through functionality does. Another thing that most of us who are well, I don't want to say bad at playing, but I am bad at playing. We want to be able to quantize our MIDI data once we have done our recording. In other DAWs, what you need to do is once you finish your recording, you select your recording and then you can quantize the recording. Pro Tools allows you to quantize as you record, right? Which means as you're doing your recording, you can Pro Tools will quantize all the MIDI data as you're playing. So you can technically sound like Mozart if you know how to play decently well. The way to actually do that is to come up to your event menu, go to event operations, and then select input quantize. This is what we call the input quantize window. Now over here, you have to enable input quantize if you want Pro Tools to quantize everything that you are playing as you are playing it. And you can even be specific as to what Pro Tools should quantize. Do you want Pro Tools to quantize only the beginning of the notes, which is the on note? Do you want Pro Tools to quantize only the off note? That means the end of every note that you play, which means every time you leave the MIDI keyboard, the end of the MIDI note is going to get snapped to the bar or beat or whatever you're choosing it to snap to. You can also tell Pro Tools to preserve the note duration, which means after you finish recording and it has quantized everything, if you try to change the start or the end of the MIDI note, Pro Tools will make sure that the duration of the note remains the same. So if I try to change the end, it will automatically move the beginning as well for me. Right? So preserve note duration means it will maintain the duration of the note that you have recorded after you finish the quantizing. And if you're recording on a 4/4 meter or a 3/4 meter, you can actually tell Pro Tools what resolution you want the quantization to happen in, right? So you want it to happen every 16th note, every 64th note, every 32nd note. You can choose, or you want everything to be at the bar, on the whole note. So you can choose your resolution for quantization as well. Default is 1/16. You can change that to whatever you want. So if you're playing something really fast and your meter is 4/4, you may want to go at a slightly higher resolution so that you can make sure that everything gets quantized at the right way. Right? So you can have it quantize. Let's go with a quarter note quantization just to give you an example over here. Again, my playing sucks, so don't judge me on that. I'm gonna just hit record, and as we see, since my meter is 4/4, everything that I play should snap to the bar, to the lines of the bar that you see over here, right? So I'm gonna just play. If you look carefully over here, you can see that all the MIDI notes are snapped to the bars and to the bars and beats that we have in our grid itself, right? So this is my MIDI information that I can see on my track. What if I wanted to edit this information? Well, if you look at the track itself, you will see that Pro Tools is currently showing me my clips. This is what we call the track view selector. That means I can choose what I want to see on this particular track, right? So I can change that, and I can tell Pro Tools to show me my MIDI notes. So if I click on my track view selector, I can tell Pro Tools show me my notes, and now Pro Tools will show me my MIDI notes that I have recorded. There's a small piano scroll right next to the meter on the track itself, and if you look really carefully, there are two arrows that allow you to change the octave that you're currently viewing. So if my MIDI notes are down, I can see from the first clip that I recorded over here, I have quite a lot of notes that are down. How do I know that? Because I can see one big blue line over here that tells me that there are more notes at the bottom of or at a lower octave, right? So I can click on the down arrow and I can bring those notes up so that I can see all my MIDI information, right? Similarly, if I click on the top arrow, I can see my MIDI information that I have recorded in my higher octaves. Right? You can edit your MIDI data directly from here. So if I bring my mouse over a MIDI note, you can see that it changes the icon to a hand tool, and I can just click and drag it right? I can snap it to the bars or the beats. That's because I'm in grid mode. It's going to snap. If I'm not in grid mode, again, your movement is unrestricted, especially if you're in the slip mode. You can move it anywhere you want, right? So you can edit your MIDI notes directly from here. You can actually use a shortcut to switch between your clips view and your notes view. And the shortcut is Control minus if you are on a Mac, or the Start Windows key and the minus key if you are on Windows, right? So Control minus will switch between the notes view and the clips view, and your Start and minus will switch between your notes view and clips view in Windows. If you double click on the MIDI clip itself using the hand tool, not the selector tool, come down, hand tool. If you double click on the clip, it will open up the MIDI editor window, or you could use a shortcut, which is Control equal, right? Command equal is going to switch between the edit window and the mix window, but the Control equal on a Mac is going to switch between your MIDI editor window and your edit window if you have MIDI data in your Pro Tools session, right? On Windows, the shortcut is Start and the equal to button, right? So Start and equal is going to change between the edit window and the MIDI editor window. Once you're in the MIDI editor window, you can have a much more detailed look at all the MIDI information that you have recorded, right? You can choose to edit one MIDI note at a time. So if I wanted to move this particular MIDI note, I could. I could change the resolution of my grid. So if I wanted a higher resolution, I could click on that and tell Pro Tools, show me a 1/64th grid, so that you can do, even more finer editing. Or you can even reduce it. So if I wanted to go to like a quarter note, it will change my bars to bars and beats view, my grid view, to a quarter note. So I see only 4 segments for every bar, right? So higher resolution will allow you to do much more detailed editing as well. If you look at the notes over here carefully though, you will see that each of these are a different shade of blue, right? The darker the color, the higher the velocity. That means that was how hard I hit my key. So if I see a light blue, that means that key was pressed really softly. If I see a dark blue note, that means I pressed that key really, really hard, right? So you can actually see the velocity as well when you're viewing your MIDI notes like this. And this is something that's actually viewable even in your edit window. So if you look at the notes in your edit window again, in the notes view, you can see that there are different shades of blue even over here. If you wanted to see the velocity for each note, again, you can come to your track view selector over here and tell Pro Tools to show you the velocity. And Pro Tools will show you velocity stocks for every single key. So if I wanted to bring down the velocity for this particular note over here, all I need to do is click on this stock over here, and then I can bring it down. And as I bring it down, you will actually notice that the color of that note is changing as well, right? So if I unselect it now, you will see that this is a really light blue. That's because the velocity is really, really low. If I bring the velocity back up, now it has changed again. It's not as light as it was before. You can view your velocity stocks even in your MIDI editor window, right? So if I come down in my MIDI editor window over here, there are tracks that will allow me to view different MIDI data. Let's hide my transport window for now. And over here you can see by default it shows you the velocity for each of these notes. I can edit the velocity for multiple notes at a time as well. So if I wanted to edit my velocity for the last few notes that I have over here, I can select all of them by just clicking and dragging over all of them like this. And now I can see that the velocity stock for these notes have been selected. They are white in color. So moving any one of them now, because all of them are selected, will actually move all of them proportionately, right? So I can maintain my performance dynamic range and still move them all in tandem, and they will maintain the dynamic range of the velocity itself. When you're in your MIDI editor window, if you are really a fan of working with notation, you can actually view your MIDI data in notation form as well. All you need to do is click on this button over here, which is the notation view, and Pro Tools will generate the entire thing in notation view for you. Here again, you can actually just click and drag to change a particular note or to change what you're seeing, right? So, or you could record it by looking at your notation as well. Again, something that not every DAW does. If you had multiple MIDI tracks over here, Pro Tools will show you multiple MIDI tracks as well in your MIDI editor window. Each of them will be different. They will not be overlaid, right? If you're not in your notation view window, you will actually see every MIDI clip or every MIDI track in a different color. So if this is blue, the other one can be green, another one will be red. It will have different colors so that you can distinguish between the instruments or the MIDI tracks or the instrument tracks that you actually have within your session, right? You can customize the color as well if you want. We'll talk about that later. Cool. So that is your MIDI editor view. So they do ask a question sometimes in the exam as to, in which window can you actually see your MIDI notes? And the thing to remember is you can see and edit your MIDI notes in your edit window as well. Your edit window is not only for audio, it is for MIDI as well. All right. Let's get rid of this now and let's start playing with some virtual instruments, right? So I'm going to get rid of this instrument track. I'm going to start afresh. I'm going to create a new instrument track for us to work with. I'm going to go with stereo and I have a fresh instrument track over here, right? Let's reset our tempo as well. I'm going to come to my mix window over here. I'm going to check, I'm going to confirm that this track is set to receive all MIDI signals that are coming into the system over here, which is correct. But in the output section of the MIDI, I see that it is going to none. That's yes, because I don't have any virtual instrument on this particular track, right? So let's go ahead and insert a virtual instrument. I come to the insert section, go to instrument, and let's start with expand. Expand is a really cool virtual instrument that comes free with Pro Tools. It's got a ton of sound samples in it as well, right? So let's record enable so that we can tell Pro Tools to send our MIDI data through to the plugin itself. So when I press any key on my keyboard, I should be hearing sound. There we go. What sound was I hearing? I was listening to something called Beneath the Waves. So if you look carefully over here, there are 4 different parts to this particular plugin. There is part A, part B, part C, and part D. Each of these parts have a power switch, which means you can turn each of them on or off. Each of them have a level control. That means you can control the volume of each part. You can control the pan of each part. And you can add effects to each part as well. In 2 effects, effects 1 and effects 2, which is decided from this section over here at the bottom. The default sound that loads up when you load this plugin is called Beneath the Waves. It's a pad. You can change that by just clicking on the name over here and then selecting a different kind of sample. Let's go with a drum loop. I'm going to go with, let's just go with something random over here. Right. So now that that is loaded up, I'm just going to press a key on my keyboard. And I hear a pretty cool loop, right? Why do I have 4 parts? I have 4 parts so that I can combine sounds to make a new sound altogether. Like, for example, I have this particular loop, but I'm not too happy with the loop. I want to modify this loop in a certain way. I want to add something more to this loop to make it sound a little bit more modern, right? So let's come to part B. Go back to loops. I'm going to add a hip hop loop to this particular loop itself. And let's see what that sounds like now. Well, sounds cool. But maybe I want to change the levels of each of these loops so that I have a slightly better control or better sounding final loop. So I'm going to come down to the pop hop loop and I'm going to reduce the volume of the pop hop loop by around 10 dB. And now I'm going to play them both together and see what that sounds like. Cool. Right? So that's what expand allows you to do. It allows you to choose multiple sounds and combine them to make your own sound, or you can choose only one particular sound. You don't have to have 4 different sounds, right? So if I wanted to add on, let's say, a vocal part to this, let's go with vocals. I'm going to go with a choir with pads. I'm going to make it a little soft and Nice. Now, if I had multiple MIDI controllers, I could actually assign different channels to each of these samples within this plugin. Like as of now, I see that all 3 samples are getting their signal from channel 1. I can change that. I can make this channel 2 and I can make this channel 3. So now in my MIDI device, if I had multiple MIDI devices connected, I could assign one MIDI device to send the data on channel 1, another MIDI device to send the data on channel 2, and a third MIDI device to send the data on channel 3. So when I press the first controller, the channel 1 controller, my part A is going to play. When I press the second controller, my part B is going to play. When I use my third controller, part C is going to play. So I don't have to have 3 instrument tracks with the same plugin 3 times in my system. That's going to take up too much CPU power. I can have one plugin, and I can have each of them on different channels. So I can have up to 4 different parts on 4 different channels over here. The plugin itself also comes with certain recommendations. So I can come to the library menu over here, which is where you see the word factory default. And I can click on it and I can see the different presets that they have. So let's say they have arpeggios over here, and I'm going to go with wood rhythm. Right? So when I select that, I can see that they have a particular setting for a particular virtual instrument, for a particular sample already preset. So when I press play, or when I press my MIDI controller now, I get the settings that have been applied for that particular sample. I can choose another one. Let's go with one which has multiple parts to it. So let's go with lava lamp, and I can see that there are 2 parts to this. There's something known as a smooth wavetable, and there's something called expectations. Both of them are different levels. Both of them have effects built in as well. So when I play this, it's going to play the combination of the smooth wavetable and the expectations. So you can play around with the presets from the library menu over here, or you can change what you want as well. There are certain controls that are there with the Expand plugin as well. So if I wanted to change the sounds of part A, I can click over here and then I can change certain parameters of that particular sound. These parameters change based on depending on the kind of sample that you have. Like the parameters that I have for the expectation sample are not the same as my smooth wavetable. So that depends on whoever's made the sample. What are the things that you can change, right? So you can apply those changes directly from here as well. And you can customize them and save them as your own preset as well. So if you like a particular combination of loops and you want to save that as a particular loop of your own, you can do that as well. So this is Expand, right? Allows you 4 different parts. So you can play all 4 at the same time, or 4 individually, or you can combine them and make different pairs, but depending on what kind of music you're working in. And all of the sounds that you see over here as part of the sound bank, all of these come with the plugin and with Pro Tools for free, right? Irrespective of which version of Pro Tools you are using. The next plugin I want to show you is a really cool one called Boom. To remove a plugin from a particular track, we click on the small dot before the name of the plugin, and then we can go to No Insert, and that takes out the plugin from the track itself. So let's go back and let's change the instrument to Boom. Boom is a drum machine. Boom is Pro Tools' drum machine. It is something that you can really, really configure and you can go crazy with. There are different drum kits that are available to you, and you can choose your drum kit from this drop down menu over here. You can choose between Urban 1, Urban 2, Dance 1, Dance 2, Electro, Night 8.0, 9.0, Fat 8, Fat 9, Retro. Multiple sets of drum kits that you can choose, what your loop should sound like, right? There is a library menu as well over here again. So depending on the tempo that you're working in, you want something between 100 to 120 BPM. You can choose, let's go with the Delta 5, and let's hit play to see what this drum loop sounds like. If I wanted the same loop but with a different kit, I can see that this Delta 105 was saved with the Electro kit. But if I wanted the same loop in a different kit, all I need to do is click on the drum kit menu and select Urban 1. So it's going to keep the loop the same, but it's just going to play it with a different set of drums, like this. Cool. You can customize each single drum. So if you like the kick sound from a particular drum kit and you like the snare from a different drum kit, you could customize that from each individual drum channel that you have over here. So let's say this is the kick. I want to click on it and I can change the kick to be from the dance drum kit. I can change my snare to be from the 8/0 drum kit, and the remaining let it be from the urban. Now let's play and see what that sounds like. Cool. You can change individual drum sounds, like you can change the pan position, you can change the volume level, you can tune it a little bit, and you can even add a little bit of decay or take out a little bit of the decay that you have. You can mute a particular drum from that particular from this particular loop as well. So if I did not want the kick in this particular loop, I can just mute the kick, and now when I press play, Pro Tools is not going to play the kick in this particular loop. Right? You can even make your own loop, right? So if you are not happy with the loop that you have over here, you can use this grid to actually compose your own loop, right? So let's select a drum kit first. I'm going to go with the Dance 1 drum kit that I have over here. And since this is, if you look at this grid really carefully, you will actually see that it is showing you a 4-bar loop. Right? You can see the slight gradient in the blacks in the background, which actually highlights the beginning of every bar. So we have bar number 1, bar number 2, bar number 3, and bar number 4. The red dots that you see over here are basically indicators showing you where exactly the sound is going to play for that particular drum. So I can see over here that the kick sound is there at the start of bar number 1, and it's there on the 3rd beat of bar number 2. But it's not there in any other position in this particular 4-bar loop. Again, you can change it to whatever you want. So let's start with a clean slate. I'm going to hit clear, and then I'm going to use my mouse to position the sounds that I want. And I want to hear what I'm positioning as I position it. So I'm going to hit play first, and I can see that it has started playing. I'm going to place my kick sound at the beginning of every bar. So I'm going to start here, 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 and here. Cool. Let's go with the snare. I'm going to place my snare at the 3rd beat of every bar. I'm going to do some claps. If you like the loop, you want to change your kit, you can just click over here and select a different kit and listen to the same loop that you made in a different kit. Right? You can even change the velocity. Now, if you click on a dot, you will see that the red color changes, right? So if I click on the same red dot for my kick, the first kick over here, I'm going to click on it again, and you will see that it has become slightly less bright. If I click on it again, it's become even less bright. And if I click on it the 4th time, it goes off. So there are 4 different velocities that you can actually choose from. You can choose loud, louder, loudest, or off, right? So it starts with the loudest. This is louder, this is loud, and this is off, right? So you have 4 different velocities that you can actually choose from. So if I wanted the kicks to be loud, but if I wanted the snares to be really soft, I could set it to be soft. Cool. So this is a really cool feature, and it even tells you which key it's going to, you're going to get this particular loop on. So as of now, it's telling me this pattern that I made is going to be on my C3 key. So when I press the C3 key on my controller, I can hear the loop. So when I'm recording in Pro Tools, if I wanted this loop at a particular time, all I need to do is press the C3 key, and it's going to play this particular loop. Right? You can, as I said, change the individual sounds. You can fine-tune the sound for each and every individual drum itself. So if I wanted to change the sound of the kick, I can change the tone of the kick by coming over here. I can make it a little lower in tone. I can change the tone of the snare, and I'm also using my crash. So I'm going to go to the crash, and I'm going to make it a really different tune altogether. Like that. All right. Again, you can use a library menu to choose one of the presets that Pro Tools has made for you, or that AIR has actually made for you. And this comes with Pro Tools as well. So all of you do have this plugin and all of the sounds that come with it. Please do take the time to play with it and experiment and see how you can really enjoy using this plugin. So this is your drum machine, right? This is a virtual instrument that takes your MIDI data, converts it to drum samples, and plays it back for you. The third instrument that I want to show you is called Falcon, right? So again, I'm going to go to my inserts, I'm going to go to instrument, and I'm going to select Falcon. Falcon is one of the newer plugins that comes with Pro Tools, and it's a really cool plugin as well. There are sound banks that come with Falcon as well, and you can see your sound banks on the right side over here. There are two sound banks that come for free. You have the Plug Sound Avid Edition, and we have the Falcon Factory. So by clicking on the name over here, it will show you all the different sound banks that are there with this plugin. To load a sound bank, I just go in, find a sound bank. Let's say I want the Dark Knight. Just double click on it, and now the sound bank has loaded. So when I hit a key on my keyboard, I get that particular sound bank, right? It's pretty cool. You don't have to have that. Some of these sound banks are really combinations of different effects and different samples together. Like this Dark Knight has a bass module. It has high, mids, and lows instruments in different frequency ranges. You're not hearing one single thing. You're hearing a combination of different sounds together. So it depends on the sound bank that you are using. Like if I go to the Avid Edition plug sound collection, you can go to orchestral, string solo. Let's go with a violin long. Double click, and this is my violin. So if I wanted to play something now, right? As I said, I'm really bad at playing. So don't judge me for that. But yeah, this is how you load sounds, and this is how you can record them. When you select a particular instrument over here and when you load it using Falcon, the piano key that you see on the bottom will actually tell you the range on your controller that you can actually select these keys and play it from. That means there's going to be no sound in this particular instrument that I have if I play it below C2. Everything is, just a couple of notes below C3 and onwards. So the C3, C4, C5, those octaves are the main octaves for this particular instrument. Anything lower than that is not going to work for you, right? So each instrument will have its own range on your keyboard. You can even control or change the sound of the samples that are there in this particular sound bank as well. And you can go crazy by experimenting with each of these controls that you have, right? If you cannot see your Falcon Factory and your Plug Sound Avid Edition over here, that could be because you have not downloaded the sound banks. The sound banks are actually to be downloaded separately. And if you log into your Avid account, you will see under the available downloads for you in Pro Tools, you need to download these two sound banks separately. Now, once you download those sound banks separately, you need to copy them after extraction. You need to copy them to a particular folder, and you need to set that folder within the Falcon plugin itself. So once you download the files, extract them and make sure you copy them into this location. It should be inside your library's application folder. There's a folder called UVI, inside which there is a folder called Falcon. Just dump these two sound banks over there. And once you move them over there, you can come to your Falcon plugin, click on the Settings tab over here, come to Preferences, and under Sound Banks, make sure that your search path for the sound banks is set to the same path. So to change that, you just click on the three dots over here and make sure you choose Macintosh HD, Library, Application Support, UVI, Falcon, and then say Open. Once you say Open, it may not show it to you immediately. You may need to take out the plugin, say No Insert, and then reinsert. So that basically resets the Falcon plugin and makes sure that you can see your Falcon Factory and your Plug Sound Avid Edition sound samples, right? So let's just select the string solo. I'll go with a staccato for now, right? And I am going to actually do a recording. And that is how we record MIDI in Pro Tools. If I come to my edit window now, I will be able to see my notes that I have recorded on my track itself. Again, if I wanted to edit it, I can double click this, and it may not, and it looks like I have my input quantize on. That's why it looks like rubbish. As a reminder, you can go and turn off your input quantize by coming to event operations and input quantize. There we go, right? So I'm already a bad player and this has made it even worse. So yeah, you could have Pro Tools quantize as you play if you want, right? So that's how you can record MIDI in Pro Tools. I'd like for all of you to try all of this, play around with the plugins itself, play around with the instrument track, understand your MIDI input output, understand your instrument input output, understand that the MIDI through, understand how you can use your MIDI instruments, play around with the grand piano, the boom plugin, expand, Falcon, some lovely sounds that come with Pro Tools that you should really, really experiment with and have fun with. And do your recordings. Start off with a MIDI track, an aux track, see how they work together, make sure you understand the signal flow between the two of them. Then start working with instrument tracks and see how you can actually expand on using an instrument track instead of a MIDI and an aux track at the same time. That has been Chapter 7 on making your first MIDI recording. I'll catch you guys later. Bye.